Greetings to everyone. Welcome back once again to my educational channel called Learn Bio with Janet. I'm teacher Janet, and today we'll continue to discuss inheritance. We are going to discuss some genetic terms that are commonly used when we study this topic and when we explain the process of inheritance. So this topic is found in your chapter 11 of the Form 5 KSSM syllabus, biology syllabus. The learning standards for today's lesson are as follows. After this lesson, we should be able to differentiate terms related to inheritance, such as genes and alleles, characteristic and trait, phenotype and genotype, dominant allele and recessive allele, dominant trait and recessive trait, homozygote and heterozygote, pure breed and hybrid, parental generation and filial generation. Now, construction of monohybrid cross diagrams will be in the next video on questions. Determine genotypic and phenotypic ratios of filial generations in a monohybrid cross, also in the next video, video 3. Describe Mendel's first law, and the drawing of the Punnett square will be in the final video, video number 4, for subtopic 11.1. So let's discuss the term characteristic and trait, which we have discussed earlier in the last video. A characteristic is a general heritable feature of an organism, such as blood group, height, color of hair, skin color, flower color, shape of seed. So a characteristic is a general feature that can be inherited. Heritable means it can be inherited. Alright? Sifat yang boleh diwarisi. And it is a general feature only, without giving any specific description of what an individual has inherited. Alright? Whereas trait is more specific, it is a variation or variant of a specific characteristic. For example, for the characteristic of hair color, a person can have brown hair, black hair, blonde hair, and even reddish color hair. So those are traits. Okay, the specific variants that tell us how the person looks like, or how a plant looks like, and so forth. So for example, the traits here, examples of traits are brown hair, blue eyes, purple flower for the pea plant, blood group A, maybe for one of your friends or for yourself. Okay, it's specific. Now, for example, another example is for the characteristic of eye color in humans, some traits or variants are green eyes, brown eyes, and blue eyes. These are all traits, right? Whereas the characteristic involved is eye color. Alright? Thirdly, an important definition that we have to know: what is a gene? A gene is defined as the basic unit of inheritance, which consists of a DNA segment located on a specific locus on a chromosome. Firstly, a gene is the basic unit of inheritance. Okay, meaning that it can be passed down from parents to offspring. It can be inherited. So the genes that we have in our body actually passed down to us from our parents. A copy of it has been made by our parents and then it was passed down to us. Alright, copies of the genes. And our genes actually come back a long way because our parents inherited it from their parents and so forth. So from our ancestors, the genes have been passed down, alright, through the generations until it has come to us. Just imagine that. Alright, then further down here it says that the structure of a gene is actually a DNA segment located on a specific locus or position on a chromosome. Okay, locus is the location or the position on a chromosome. So each gene has a specific location on a chromosome. Alright, maybe for on chromosome number 1 there's a particular gene that determines a particular characteristic, and it is found on a particular location on the chromosome. Right, that is fixed. So a gene controls a specific characteristic of an organism, such as flower color, blood group, color of eyes. So there are many types of genes that control different characteristics. For the pea plant, there's a gene that controls the flower color, whether the plant will produce purple flowers or white flowers. It's all controlled by genes, right? And our blood group is also controlled by the genes that we inherit from our father and our mother. So the interaction between the genes will produce the blood group that we have, all right? The interaction between the paternal and the maternal genes. Now this picture shows us the location of the genes. Let's say we refer to a human being. So in the human being there are many cells, and in each cell there's a nucleus, and in the nucleus there are many chromosomes, 46 chromosomes in a diploid cell. So each chromosome consists of a very long strand of DNA that's wound tightly around the proteins called the histones. So if we unravel the strand of DNA, we'll find that it's very long and it has the structure like a double helix, as we have studied in Form 4. So a gene is actually a segment of the DNA. Can be a long segment or section, can be a short segment or section, depending on what gene it is, right? And in that segment of DNA is the hidden information or instructions to make a specific protein for the body's use. Okay, so what is it that's so special about each gene? It is the sequence of bases that are different between the genes. All right, the bases are, for example, can you recall the bases? Nitrogenous bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, right? So the sequence of these bases in the center part of the DNA molecule forms the genetic code for the synthesis of a particular protein. And the synthesis of the protein will determine a particular characteristic or trait in a person. The next important term that we have to remember is allele, which is common in a common question in SPM, right? So it's not pronounced allele, it's allele. So an allele is defined as an alternative form or version of a gene that controls a specific trait, right? So the alleles are all the possible forms of a particular gene. Let's look at this diagram below. So we can say it like this: the gene for the characteristic of height consists of two forms, allele for trait of tall stem and allele for trait of dwarf stem. Okay, so the alleles are the forms of a gene and it controls a particular trait. For example, we have the allele for trait of tall stem. So when we talk about a trait and the unit of inheritance that controls that trait, we must use the word allele, not gene. Gene is used for the unit of inheritance that controls a particular characteristic. So it's more general. Okay, use the word genes for characteristic and alleles for traits. So we can assign letters to represent the alleles that control the various traits. For example, we usually follow the trait, the name of the trait. So for example, tall stem, since it's a dominant trait, meaning the so-called stronger trait is controlled by a dominant allele, and we can assign a letter big T for it, capital T. Now the word dominant will be discussed later. And for allele, for the trait of dwarf stem, we assign the letter small t. Okay, one big T, one small t, as we have discussed in the previous video. So dominant alleles or stronger alleles, within inverted commas, can be assigned letters, capital letters. And recessive alleles or weaker alleles are assigned the small letters to represent them. Okay, the lowercase letters. Okay, let's come back to our explanation here. So an allele is an alternative form of a gene or version of a gene that controls a specific trait. And the second characteristic of alleles are the alleles of the same gene, such as gene for characteristic of height, must have the same loci or locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes. Okay, for the simple Mendelian inheritance that we are studying. So for example, in last the last lesson, we talked about the inheritance of tall stem and dwarf stem. So let's say this is a cell containing the 2 chromosomes that carry the alleles for height, the gene for height. So the alleles big T and small t that controls the specific trait, such as tall stem and dwarf stem, must be at the same location or locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes. The homologous chromosomes have the same size, the same position of centromere, and they carry the same type of genes. Okay, and one comes from the male parent, it's called the paternal chromosome. The other is from the female parent, called the maternal chromosome. All right, so you cannot have one big T here and then the small t is somewhere far down below or near to the centromere. It must be at the same locus on the pair of homologous chromosomes. So maybe here you have big T, small t. Further down here, maybe there's another pair of alleles, small f, big F. They are the same locus, same position on the pair of homologous chromosomes. So remember, they have the same loci or locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes if they are alleles of the same gene. So an allele controls a specific trait, and it can be represented by a letter. We can assign a letter for it. So capital A is a dominant allele, small a is the recessive allele. Capital T, dominant allele, small t, recessive allele, and so forth. So use either capital or small letters, depending on whether the allele is a dominant allele or a recessive allele. This diagram is commonly asked in the SPM objective questions, so we have to understand what it means, right? So here we see a pair of homologous chromosomes with the alleles on them. So what are homologous chromosomes? Homologous chromosomes consist of 2 chromosomes that have the same structure, the same length, the same position of centromere, and they carry the same type of genes. One chromosome comes from the male parent and is called the paternal chromosome. The other one comes from the female parent and is called the maternal chromosome. All right? So the letters on the chromosomes represent the alleles. Okay, each letter represents an allele, and an allele is a form of a gene that controls a specific trait. Okay, alleles are all the possible forms of a gene that controls a characteristic, but the allele controls a specific trait. Now, what about gene locus? The gene locus, for example, here is a gene locus, okay, for the allele A, big A. So this gene locus is the location of a gene on a chromosome, or the position of a gene, and this location is very specific for each gene, right? So, for example, the locus of the gene that controls the characteristic of height in pea plant is here, just above the centromere. So we say that this gene controls the characteristic of height here. And this gene consists of 2 alleles, allele big T and allele small t, and they are both found on the same locus. Okay, so maybe allele big T controls the tall trait or tall stem trait in a plant. So a plant that has this allele will be tall, because this allele big T will determine that it will be tall. Okay, and then on the other chromosome you see allele small t is on the same locus as the allele big T, and it controls the dwarf trait, or determines that the plant is has a dwarf stem or short stem. Okay, so you can see that the 2 alleles of the same gene have the same locus on the pair of homologous chromosomes, lastly, here we see a pair of identical dominant alleles, big J and big J, of the same gene that controls a specific trait. So if we have a pair of identical dominant alleles, identical alleles first, then we call this organism homozygous from the aspect of this trait, whatever the trait is. It is homozygous, okay, for this trait, meaning that it has 2 identical alleles on the pair of homologous chromosomes at the same locus, right? And so homo means the same, so meaning that it has 2 identical alleles. And because it's a dominant allele involved, so we say that the organism is homozygous dominant for this trait, particular trait. Whereas for another trait controlled by big N and small n here, we say that the organism is heterozygous for this trait because it has one dominant allele here and one recessive allele. So these two alleles are different. Therefore, we use the word hetero, meaning different, heterozygous, to describe this organism from the aspect of this particular trait. Okay, it is heterozygous. But from the aspect of another trait, like the one that is controlled by big J, it is homozygous. Okay, and if it has two recessive alleles, like small, let's say small m here, so it is homozygous for the trait controlled by small m, and it's called homozygous recessive because the allele is a recessive allele, small m. The next term that we must understand is genotype, right? So genotype is the genetic composition of an organism that cannot be seen. It is the genetic content in the diploid cell of an organism. And this genetic composition cannot be seen with the eyes, okay? But in real life, genetic composition can be tested genetically, all right, to find out what the genes are. So the genotype consists of a pair of letters which represent a pair of alleles, like big T, small t, or small t. These are all genotypes. So if you're asked to give a genotype of something in the exam, make sure that you know this is actually the genotype for monohybrid inheritance will consist of a pair of letters, where each letter is one allele. All right. So the word gen here, geno, that's why it comes from the word gene. So it means the genetic composition of the organism, right? So big T and big T small t are the genotypes for the tall pea plant in Mendel's experiment, which we studied in the first video, right? And small t is the genotype for the dwarf pea plant, okay, which we also discussed in that video. So to picture these genotypes, for example, big T, small t, we can picture it how the cells would look like, or how the alleles will be found in the cell or arranged in the cell. So if the genotype is big T, small t, that means that on a pair of homologous chromosomes, on one of the chromosomes you have a big T allele, the allele for tall stem, and on the other one there's the allele for dwarf stem, which is small t, like this. The alleles are found on a pair of homologous chromosomes if they're of the same gene. Okay. So can you give me some examples of genotypes? Right. It should be a pair of letters, where each letter represents an allele. Big H, big N, and small d, for example. Okay. So in the first case is if it consists of two dominant alleles, we can call this genotype or this person homozygous dominant. Okay, we'll come to that later. And an organism which has one dominant allele, big N, and one recessive allele, small n, is called a heterozygote or a hybrid. And if the organism has two recessive alleles, like small d, this is its genotype. And another way to describe the genotype is that it is homozygous recessive, having two identical alleles, so we call it homozygous. Recessive means that consists of the recessive or weaker alleles, small d. So don't worry, we'll be coming to these terms again later. Phenotype, on the other hand, means the observable characteristic or trait of an organism that can be seen. So the phenotype is determined by the genotype or the genes in the cells, right? Can you give me some examples of phenotype other than purple flower? Here we have the wrinkled seed, brown eyes, tall trait, okay, in the plant. So what are the other examples of phenotype? Right, tall stem, purple flower, curly hair, blood group A, wrinkled seed, brown eyes. So a phenotype is actually a trait that is shown by the organism. It's a trait. Here's another important term, dominant allele, also frequently tested in SPM. So a dominant allele is an allele which always shows its trait when it is present in a cell or organism. The word dominant means to have power or influence over others. Okay? And secondly, the dominant allele suppresses the effect of the recessive allele. It suppresses means it covers or masks the effect of the recessive allele. Or you can say menindas or menutup kesan allele recessive. So the dominant allele shows its phenotype or its trait when it is in the homozygous condition, for example, big T, or in the heterozygous condition, for example, for the genotype, big T, small t. Okay, so if you take the example of Mendel's experiment in the first video, big T stands for allele for tall stem, and small t is the allele for dwarf stem. So in the organism with genotype big T, this organism is said to have the homozygous condition because homo means the same, because it has two identical alleles, big T in each of its cells. And the heterozygous condition is describes an organism which has one dominant allele big T and one recessive allele small t in each of its cells. Okay, hetero means different. So it has one dominant allele and one recessive allele in the cells. So in these two conditions, as long as the big T is present, you see the big T is present in this homozygous condition or heterozygous condition, okay, the dominant allele is present, so it will always show its effect. So plants with these genotypes, big T or big T small t, are tall. Okay, that means because tall trait is the dominant trait. So the dominant allele will show its phenotype, which is the dominant trait, and that's the tall trait in this case. So just like the analogy of a bully that suppresses the shy or timid person, right? So in this cartoon, we see the big T says, I will express my trait. And the small t has to agree, yes boss, and raises the white flag and surrender. Okay, so it's like the analogy of a bully. The dominant allele is like a bully, and it suppresses the effect of the recessive allele, which is like the shy person that sits quietly like a timid mouse when the big bully is around and doesn't do anything. Okay, so this is just an analogy. Now dominant alleles are represented by capital letters, so if you're asked to assign a letter for a dominant allele, please give it the capital letters or big letters, big E, big T, big G, big H. Small letters or lowercase letters are reserved for the recessive alleles. Now how do we state it? How do we state the effect of the dominant allele? So we can say allele for tall stem big T is dominant compared to the allele for short stem small t. Or allele for curly hair big H is dominant to the allele for straight hair small h. Can you give me some examples of dominant alleles for humans or for pea plants? Okay, right. Allele for tall stem, round seed, and purple flower in the pea plant. They are all dominant alleles. Okay. For example, for the pea plant, the allele for purple flower is dominant to the allele for white flower. And for humans, curly hair, allele for curly hair, free earlobe are dominant alleles. Alright, so the allele for free earlobe is dominant to the allele for attached earlobe. So in contrast to the dominant allele, we have the recessive allele, also important for SPM questions. Let's memorize the definition. A recessive allele is an allele which only shows its trait when both alleles in a cell are recessive alleles. For example, small t. Let's say small t represents the allele for dwarf stem. Okay, referring back to Mendel's first experiment that we discussed in the first video. So small t represents the allele for dwarf stem, right? So it will only show its trait if both the alleles in the organism or in the diploid cell are recessive alleles. That means both are small t alleles, the allele small t. Such an organism is called a homozygous recessive organism, right? Homozygous means having two identical alleles. Recessive means that the allele is the recessive allele. That means having two identical recessive alleles. All right. So this type of homozygous recessive organism will be showing the recessive trait, right? Because it does not have a dominant allele, big T, to suppress it, to suppress its effect. Okay, just like in this cartoon, you see that these two small t's are happy because they can express their trait. Without big T, we can express ourselves. Okay, but if the big T allele, that is the allele for tall stem, is in the organism, then it will suppress the effect of the small t allele, which is the allele for dwarf stem. Okay, so the recessive allele is only able to show its trait if both the alleles in the cell are recessive alleles. Now, the effect of the recessive allele is suppressed by the presence of the dominant allele in a heterozygote, for example, big T, small t, that contains one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Okay, so whenever the big T allele, the dominant allele, any dominant allele is around, it will suppress the effect of the recessive allele. Example, in Mendel's experiment for a plant with genotype big T, small t, allele big T suppresses the effect of allele small t. So allele big T will instead express its trait while suppressing the effect of allele small t. And so the plant will be tall because the big T allele is the allele for tall stem. Okay, so the plant will be tall, and that is the way that allele big T expresses its trait. And usually, we assign small letters or lowercase letters to represent recessive alleles. Okay, whereas capital letters are used to represent the dominant alleles. Now, can you give me an example of a recessive allele for humans or for the pea plant? Okay, if you're asked to give an example of recessive allele, you can state the allele for dwarf stem or the allele for straight hair. For example, the allele for straight hair is a recessive allele compared to the allele for curly hair, which is a dominant allele. The next term is dominant trait. So a dominant trait is a trait that is controlled by a dominant allele. All right. So it is a trait that is expressed when both alleles of a particular gene are dominant alleles. For example, big T, or when a dominant allele is paired with a recessive allele, big T, small t, then the dominant trait will be expressed in the organism. Okay, so it's a trait that is expressed when the organism is homozygous dominant, for example, having the genotype big T, or heterozygous, having one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So you can see here that in both organisms, the dominant allele is present, right? Like for example, big T here and this big T here. So it will express the dominant trait, which is tall stem. For example, tall stem. Okay. So examples are presence of dimples. All right, the two depressions here on the face, on the cheeks. Okay, that gives a person a cute look like that. And this is a dominant trait compared to the absence of dimples, which is a recessive trait. Purple flower is a dominant trait because it is determined by the dominant allele for purple flower. Tall stem is a dominant trait, which is determined by the dominant allele for tall stem, big T. Curly hair, able to roll the tongue. Okay, so next, examples of genotypes that show dominant traits will be either homozygous dominant, that means having two dominant alleles, or heterozygous, the organisms that are heterozygous, for example, having one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Okay, so in both these cases, the dominant allele, big B, will be present, right? And it will express its trait. And that trait will be the dominant trait. Okay? So just like the dominant allele controls or determines the dominant trait, so the recessive allele also determines or controls the recessive trait, right? So a recessive trait is a trait that's expressed if a recessive allele is paired with another recessive allele, like small t, like in the genotype small t, okay, the plant with the genotype small t, where there are two recessive alleles in the diploid cell, will express the trait of dwarf stem, which is a recessive trait. So a homozygous recessive organism, such as small t, or small r, will always express the recessive trait. So homo here means identical or same. So this organism has two identical recessive alleles. So it will express the recessive trait, whatever that may be, all right, that may be represented, okay, by the alleles here. Now, what are some recessive traits in humans? Blue eyes is a recessive trait compared to black or brown eyes, which is the dominant trait. Blood group O is a recessive trait compared to blood group A or B, which are dominant traits. Straight hair is a recessive trait compared to curly hair, which is a dominant trait. Can you give one more example of recessive traits? Okay, one more example can be black. Blonde hair or yellow hair is a recessive trait compared to black hair, which is a dominant trait. So when the genotype has two small letters, small b, small t, and the letters represent the recessive alleles, right, when it's a lowercase or small letters, then we know that the organism will show the recessive trait that is connected to these alleles, okay? Here are some interesting dominant traits and recessive traits that we can check out for ourselves, okay? So you can test yourself to see whether you have the dominant traits or the recessive traits, and then compare with your siblings and also with your parents, okay, to see who you are more similar to. So those with the dominant trait are homozygous dominant, having two dominant alleles, or heterozygous, having one dominant allele and one recessive allele, okay? Whereas those with the recessive trait will have two recessive alleles together in the same cell. All right? That means they are homozygous recessive. So only one genotype here for the recessive trait. So examples of dominant traits are ability to roll the tongue, right? Whereas recessive trait here is the inability to roll the tongue for this case. And then for the second case, widow's peak means that the hairline is V-shaped when the hair is pulled back. And that's a dominant trait. The recessive trait is straight hairline, where there is no V-shaped structure here, or V-shaped hairline. Curly hair is dominant, a dominant trait, and straight hair is a recessive trait. So most probably, if you have curly hair, if a person has curly hair, one of the parents will show the dominant trait too, at least one. Could be both parents, or maybe one of them will show the curly hair trait. Normal thumb is a dominant trait, but there's a type of thumb where the thumb bends backwards. Okay, like when a hitchhiker is trying to thumb a leaf, they will angle the thumb backwards. They will try to do that. So this one is the thumb can bend backwards, almost right angle sometimes, at a right angle here. That's called the hitchhiker's thumb. Having dimples is a dominant trait, and the absence of dimples is a recessive trait. Free earlobe, where the earlobe hangs out like this, is a dominant trait. And attached earlobe, where the earlobe is attached to the face directly, this is a recessive trait. For pea plant, yellow seed is a dominant trait, and green seed is a recessive trait. The next genetic term is homozygote, or homozygous organism, or a purebred. Purebred, is it the same as purebred? According to Wikipedia, purebred is sometimes called a purebred, okay? But if you type it in Google, they may sometimes correct your word purebred and change it to purebred. So I think purebred is more commonly used in the science articles and in the science books, all right? Coming back to this word, homozygote. Homo means the same, all right? So in this type of organism, the homozygote or homozygous organism, both alleles of a particular gene at the same locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes are the same. Okay, for example, big T or small t. So we take the example of the first experiment that we discussed in the first video that was done by Mendel on the height of the pea plant. Big T represents the allele for tall stem, small t represents the allele for dwarf stem. Okay, so both these, the organisms with genotype big T and small t, they are both homozygotes because both of them have identical alleles for the gene of height. Okay, and for example, for this genotype big T, for this organism with the genotype big T, each allele big T is found on a chromosome, and the two alleles are on a pair of homologous chromosomes at the same locus on the chromosomes. Okay, and they are identical to each other. Similarly, for the organism with genotype small t, its alleles are found at the same locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes, right? And they are identical. So there are two types of homozygotes here: the homozygous dominant organism and the homozygous recessive organism. So for the homozygous dominant organism, it has two dominant alleles, big T, okay, in each cell. Whereas for the homozygous recessive organism, it has two recessive alleles together in each cell. Okay, so examples of homozygous dominant organism, other examples are big G, big H, and so forth. All made up of the genotype consists of two capital letters, which represent two dominant alleles. And for the homozygous recessive organism, its genotype consists of two small letters like small g, small h, which represent two recessive alleles. Now, how about heterozygote or heterozygous individual or a hybrid? Hetero means different. So, for this type of organism, the two alleles of a particular gene at the same locus on a pair of homologous chromosomes are different. The two alleles are different. For example, there's one dominant allele, big T, and one recessive allele, small t. Okay, so it's a genotype with one dominant allele and one recessive allele, one capital letter and one small letter, like big B, small b. The organism with this genotype is a heterozygote. Okay, big T, small t, and so forth. So can you think of one example of a genotype, okay, which represents or shows that the organism is a heterozygote? Okay, for example, big G, small g. In conclusion, for monohybrid inheritance, there are usually only 3 different genotypes and 2 different phenotypes, although there may be some exceptions. Referring back to the first experiment in the first video that was carried out by Mendel on the characteristic of height, there are 3 different genotypes. Big T, and this organism which has this genotype is said to be homozygous dominant, true breeding, or pure breed, a pure breed. Okay, and then we have the genotype big T, small t. The organism which has this genotype is said to be heterozygous, having one dominant allele and one recessive allele, and it is a hybrid or a mixed breed. And lastly, small t. The organism with such a genotype is said to be homozygous recessive. It's also true breeding like the first one, and it is a pure breed. So for the phenotypes, there are only 2 in this case. Okay, there's the tall plant or the dwarf plant. So if a plant is tall, we cannot say for sure that it is homozygous dominant or heterozygous until we test it in various ways. Okay, but for a dwarf plant, we are quite certain if it's a dwarf plant showing the recessive trait, it must be homozygous recessive for that trait, meaning having 2 recessive alleles in each of its cells, small t and small t. Let's finish up with this list of terms. The parental generation is the first generation of 2 individuals which are mated to predict or analyze genotypes of their offsprings. Referring back to our first video about Mendel's experiment on the characteristic of height, the parental generation consists of the parents, which are the pure breed tall plant and the pure breed dwarf plant. Remember that? So they were mated or crossed, and then their offspring was obtained by Mendel, and then he analyzed the genotypes of their offsprings. Okay, right, then their offsprings are called the filial generation, the first filial generation. So a filial generation is a successive generation that is a result of mating between individuals of purebred parental generation, as seen here, okay, as discussed just now. And example is the F1 generation, or the first filial generation. After that, the first filial generation was crossed among themselves, and then it produced the second filial generation, right? Now, purebred or purebred actually refers to a homozygote, right? Textbook use the word purebred, so we'll use this. But from different sources, other sources, you may call the word purebred may be used. So actually, they are homozygotes. A homozygote is an organism that has two identical alleles for a trait, right? So purebred is also like that. It has two identical alleles for a trait. For example, the genotype of a purebred could be big T, small t, or big G, or small a. Okay, in other words, it can be homozygous dominant organism or homozygous recessive organism. Now, self-cross between two purebreds with the same trait always produces offsprings with the same traits or characteristics in every generation. So if we take two purebreds, for example, the purebred tall plant, and we crossed it with another purebred tall plant, all right? So that's called a self-cross because the two plants are of the same type. Now, if you cross a purebred tall plant with another one of the same type, it will produce offsprings which are also purebred tall. Okay, so the offspring will have the same traits or characteristics in every generation. All right, so you take the offspring and cross it among themselves, you still get the same characteristics or traits. That means the second generation, the second filial generation, okay, which is the offspring of the first filial generation, will also be the same. Now having the, it should also be tall, and it's a purebred. Hybrid is the same as heterozygote. That means this hybrid is a product of mating between two purebred varieties, such as the purebred tall plant and the purebred dwarf plant. If they are crossed, they produce the F1 generation, which are all hybrids, having one dominant allele from the tall plant and one recessive allele from the short plant, big T, small t. Okay, so hybrids will have the genotypes big R, small r, big T, small t, and so forth, meaning they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele for that trait, all right, for a particular characteristic or that is involved. We have come to the end of our discussion on the terms related to inheritance. Then here are the notes which some of you may want to copy based on the definitions that were given in the textbook. Okay, I've edited it so that it is more systematic and to clarify some of the things that are stated. So you can screenshot this and then copy into your notes. There are about 4 pages here, 4 slides related to this. This is the second page of the notes. So you can copy it down in your notebook, because copying the notes will help you to understand it better and also to remember it. And furthermore, you'll be able to collect some notes, good notes for your revision later on. So you can print screen these notes or screenshot it. So this is the third slide or third page of the notes. This is the fourth and final page on the notes on terms related to inheritance. So you can screenshot and copy it, and also please memorize the terms. If you want to be good in genetics, you've got to memorize the meaning or definitions of terms such as alleles, genes, homozygous, individual, and also dominant allele, recessive allele, etc. Okay? Now, watch out for my next video, which is still subtopic 11.1, part 3, the third video, because I'm going to show you how to tackle genetic questions. So we're going to take a few samples of genetic questions. We'll start from the simple ones first to test your understanding and reinforce your learning first. And then at the end, I will give you an outline how to tackle genetic questions, how to draw the schematic diagrams based on the questions. So watch out for the next video. So that's all for this lesson. Do share, like, and subscribe. And till we meet again, goodbye.